Rowan Ashvane was good at exactly one thing, and it was the kind of thing that only mattered when everything around him was already falling apart. He was 33 years old, a wound-mender by trade. 8 years on the healer's carts of Fen Hollow settlement, and he had built his entire adult life around a single skill: the ability to walk into the worst moment of a stranger's day and hold steady while the world tilted under both of them. Broken bones, collapsed lungs, bleeding that wouldn't stop until his hands told it to. Those he could handle. Those he was trained for. Those had protocols and procedures, and a clear sequence of steps that ended in either a life saved or a loss recorded. And either way, the work was finished, and the next call was already waiting. The part of his life that didn't have protocols, the part where the thing falling apart was his own heart and not somebody else's body, that part Rowan Ashvane had spent 8 years avoiding with the particular disciplined dedication of a man who understood that some wounds heal faster if you never look at them directly. He was avoiding it again on a Tuesday afternoon in early spring, sitting in a leather chair in the bondscribe's chamber on Fen Hollow's main road, waiting for a dead man's wishes to be read aloud by a clerk who kept clearing his throat like he was trying to dislodge something more than phlegm. Aldhen Ashvane, Rowan's uncle, his mother's eldest brother, the closest thing to a real father he had ever known, had died 2 weeks earlier in his sleep. The healer who examined him called it peaceful. Rowan still hadn't managed to believe that word applied to anything about losing the man who had taught him to ride a horse, who had sat with him the night he decided to apprentice under the settlement's wound-menders instead of finishing the merchant's ledger course his mother had wanted for him, who had never once in 33 years made Rowan feel like he was too much for a room or not enough for one. Bondscribe Halwick had a stack of documents in front of him and a pair of wire-rimmed spectacles he kept adjusting, the kind of man who treated paperwork the way some men treated prayer, reverently, and with an awareness that the words on the page had more power than the person reading them. "There's one more party joining us. Should be here shortly." Rowan assumed it was his cousin Torvin. Aldhen had 2 brothers, and Torvin and Rowan were the last nephews left between them. Different fathers, same bloodline, the same uncle who'd been more of a father to both than either of theirs had managed. Torvin and Aldhen had never been close, not really, but blood was blood in a settlement this size, and Rowan figured his cousin had earned whatever seat the will provided. The door opened. It wasn't Torvin. It was Kael. Rowan hadn't seen Kael in 8 years. Not really. Not close enough to notice that her hair was shorter now, pulled back in the efficient knot that stone shapers wear when they've spent the morning bent over a drafting table, hands chalked with marble dust, temples bare. She was tall, taller than he remembered, or maybe he'd just spent 8 years slowly shrinking her in his memory to make the absence easier to carry, and her skin held the deep gray green of orc blood, the kind of coloring that caught afternoon light through Halwick's window and turned it into something sharper than the room deserved. Her tusks, the lower canines that curved upward past her lip in the way of full-blooded orcs, caught the light too, and for a half-second Rowan's chest did something it hadn't done in years. It remembered. She stopped in the doorway, like she'd walked into the wrong room, and was deciding whether to correct the mistake or commit to it. Rowan. Kael. That was the whole reunion. 8 years compressed into 2 names, spoken like passwords. Neither of them was sure still worked. She sat down across from him, as far as the small chamber allowed, and set a folder on her knees like it might protect her from something. Her eyes didn't find his again after that first glance. They found the wall behind him instead, which was safer, and both of them knew it. Halwick cleared his throat once more and began. The hold, the lakeside hold on Greymere that Aldhen had built with his own hands the year he married Rowan's aunt Elara, the one with the porch that faced the water and the iron wood stove that never quite drew right when the wind came from the north, had been left to the 2 of them, not split into 2 properties, not one buying the other out, equal undivided shares in the whole of it. Halwick read slowly, the particular measured cadence of a man who wanted every word to land exactly where it was aimed. Neither party may sell, lease, modify, or alter so much as a fence post without the co-signed consent of the other. The property exists as a single entity, jointly held, jointly maintained, jointly decided. A pause. Howick glanced at Rowan over his spectacles. There's one more clause. Your uncle insisted on it. And I'll confess I counseled against it, but he was, characteristically, unmoved. Howick turned to a separate page, older looking than the rest, written in a hand that Rowan recognized as his uncle's. He invoked the shared hearthstone provision. Kael's head came up. It was the first time since sitting down that she'd moved with any urgency, and the fact that she knew what those words meant before Howick explained them told Rowan something he hadn't been prepared to learn, that she was more connected to Aldhen's world and to the old ways embedded in it than he had understood. For those unfamiliar, Howick continued, though the explanation was clearly aimed at Rowan, a shared hearthstone clause is an old tradition, Orc in origin, adopted into settlement law generations ago. It means both names have been inscribed on the hold's hearthstone. In practical terms, neither name can be removed without physically splitting the stone. In cultural terms, he paused, choosing his words with the care of a man handling something that might cut him. It means the hold recognizes two keepers, one fire, two names. The hold cannot belong fully to one without the other's flame beside it. Silence. Howick set the document down and removed his spectacles, which was the most human gesture Rowan had ever seen him make. I told your uncle it was unusual. He told me he knew exactly what he was doing. He was smiling when he said it. Rowan looked at Kael. She was staring at the folder in her lap, jaw tight, the muscles along her tusks working the way they do when an orc is holding something back that the body wants to release. Words or tears, or both. And Rowan understood, the way you understand weather changing before the sky actually moves, that she hadn't known either. Whatever Aldhen had planned, he'd planned it alone. And the two of them were only now discovering they were standing in the middle of it. Howick slid one more thing across the desk, a plain envelope, sealed, Rowan's name on the front in Aldhen's blocky handwriting. Separate from the will. He asked me to give it to you privately. Rowan put it in his coat pocket, where it sat like a stone for the rest of the meeting. They walked out onto the main road together because there wasn't a way not to. The settlement moved around them the way it always did. Carts on the cobblestones, smoke from the forge on the corner, a woman waving from a porch 2 doors down, and none of it seemed to notice that 2 people were standing in the middle of it, trying to remember how to occupy the same stretch of air. Kael stopped beside her horse and looked at him. The particular, guarded look of someone who used to know everything about a person and now doesn't know anything at all and isn't sure which version is harder to stand next to. I guess we have to figure this out. I guess we do. She mounted and rode, and it wasn't until Rowan was halfway to his own horse that he realized he'd been holding his breath through the entire meeting, waiting for her to say something else, something that never came. He sent word to his shift commander before he'd left the main road, asking for 2 weeks he hadn't planned on needing. She didn't ask why. In a settlement this size, everybody already knew whose will had been read that morning, and grief was still the one currency nobody questioned the spending of. Howick's message reached him that evening, a note carried by a courier's boy, after Rowan had sat outside the lake house hold for 20 minutes without going in. There's something else you should know. The settlement had been sending Aldhen land tithe notices since the previous year. 2 years' worth of unpaid assessments had accumulated while his uncle's healer costs ate through whatever savings he'd kept. 28,600 marks. The settlement council had already begun proceedings before he died. Fen Hollow doesn't let a delinquency run past a year without moving toward auction. The date's set, 4 weeks out. Even if it went to sale, settlement law gave the deed holders a year afterward to redeem it, pay off what was owed plus whatever the buyer put in, interest and fees. But that wasn't the kind of year either of them could afford to spend, clawing back something that already belonged to them. Your cousin Torvin has contacted my office twice since the funeral, Howick's note continued. He's mentioned a buyer, a representative from the Iron Shore Trading Consortium. They've been acquiring shoreline properties around Greymere for the past 2 seasons. I'm not suggesting that means anything. I'm saying it's worth knowing. Rowan sat with the note in his hand a long time after finishing it, staring at the hold through the last of the daylight. The porch bench still had the worn spot in the wood where he and Kael used to sit, trying to share a seat built for one person, back when he was 22 and thought that kind of crowding was the whole point of being in love. Her shoulder against his arm along the back of the bench, the particular, deliberate architecture of two people who hadn't yet learned that closeness isn't the same as staying. He didn't go inside that night. He rode home instead, sat at his kitchen table, and opened the envelope. Aldhen's letter wasn't long. Rowan, I've spent the last 4 years not knowing what to do with something that was never mine to keep. It's in my lake ledger, on the shelf by the wood stove, in the back where I've kept it safe. I never read past the first line, not because I wasn't curious, but because it wasn't addressed to me. Whatever you decide once you find it, decide it together with her, not around her. Don't let two proud people turn 8 years into 20. The house was never really the point. Love, Uncle Des. Rowan read it 3 times. He didn't understand most of it yet, but he understood enough to know that whatever waited on that shelf had something to do with why Kael had looked at him in Howick's chamber, like he was a stranger wearing a face she used to trust. She arrived 4 days later on a Saturday, her horse already tied at the post by the time Rowan got there with a crate of rags and a level he didn't yet know he'd need. He found her in the kitchen, one hand running along the stone counter the way stone shapers do when they're reading a surface, not checking for damage exactly, but listening to it, the way a wound-mender listens to her heartbeat, feeling for what the material was trying to tell her. Figured you'd want to sell, he offered, because it was easier than saying anything true. Stonebridge is a long ride from a leaking roof. She turned around fast enough that he knew he'd guessed wrong. This hold is the only place that ever felt like it was mine. Her voice had the particular fierce clarity of a person defending something they'd already decided wasn't up for negotiation. I'm not signing my half over to strangers, so they can turn it into a merchant's retreat with a bathing pool. She ran a hand along the kitchen door frame where a decade of pencil marks still climbed toward the lintel. Dates scratched beside them in Aldhen's hand, a crooked ruler line connecting each one to the last. Aldhen used to measure me here every summer, same as you. Her fingers found the highest mark, the one where the pencil line met a small scratched letter K, the same way an R sat beside Rowan's. I told him once that I wanted to build holds because of this one. Stone shaping. He never let me forget I said that. Rowan hadn't expected that. He'd spent 8 years building a version of her in his head, the one who left for a bigger life in Stonebridge and never looked back. And she was standing in his uncle's kitchen, defending a hold she hadn't set foot in for years, with a fierceness that didn't match the story he'd told himself. Then we fix it, both of us. Whatever that takes. Something eased in her shoulders, the way ice gives just before it actually cracks. They might have stood there another minute, both of them working out whether what they'd just agreed to was a truce or a ceasefire. If old Marin hadn't let herself in through the screen door without knocking, the way she'd been doing since before either of them could reach a doorknob. She set a covered clay dish on the counter, like she was staking territorial claim to the surface. Saw both your horses. She'd run the tavern on the corner of the main road and Birch Lane longer than Rowan had been alive, and she'd known Aldhen longer than either of them had existed. She looked between them with the satisfaction of a woman who'd been waiting years for exactly this scene. About time, which could have meant the house, or could have meant them. She didn't clarify. She stayed long enough to tell them the stew needed 40 minutes over low heat, and to mention, almost as an aside, the way you slide a knife under a conversation, that Aldhen had taken a bad fall the previous winter, cracked his hip, slowed down enough that he needed help. He was too stubborn to ask his own nephews for, and that Torvin had been coming by ever since. Practically living in that post box, Marin said, shaking her head. Real helpful, that boy. Always so eager to carry things in for your uncle. She said it lightly. The way you say something you haven't quite decided is worth worrying about yet. On her way out, she squeezed Kael's hand. The particular, firm squeeze of a woman who has decided you belong somewhere and intends to enforce it, and paused at the door long enough to add, "One more thing. Your uncle used to sit at my counter every Sunday morning and tell me the two of you would figure yourselves out eventually." Man was stubborn as a fence post about most things, never once doubted that, though. Then the screen door banged shut, the way it always had, and she was gone before either of them could ask what exactly he'd meant by it. Kael looked at Rowan. Torvin was handling his messages. First I'm hearing of it. Neither of them said anything else about it that day, but Rowan noticed she filed it away the same careful way he did, tucked behind her eyes for later, in the place where things that don't make sense yet go to wait until they do. If this story already has you, if you felt the weight of two names carved into the same hearthstone, or a dead man's letter pointing towards something hidden on a shelf, Part 2 is where the hold starts to give up its secrets. What Rowan finds in Aldhen's ledger changes everything. What Kael carved into the porch bench years ago changes it again. And someone who doesn't belong in the driveway shows up with a smile that has too many teeth behind it. Come back for Part 2. White, outfitted, dirty, and violent. Sometimes the arrow found in all the drive, whatever it is. Whatever she says, in the world of some's altitude, forgets how. Subscribe to the Orcish Saga. 1 fire. 2 names. The story's just catching. The days after that blurred into courier messages about insurance writers and a shared ledger Kael set up without asking whether Rowan wanted one. Because stone shapers organize the way they build, structurally, with columns and load-bearing walls in place, before anyone else has decided where the front door goes. Both of them learning to talk to each other again through the safest subjects available. Deductibles, contractor estimates, whether the dock needed replacing before the lake froze. It wasn't much. It was also the first time in 8 years either of them had a reason to send the other a message back. They spent the following Tuesday evening going through Aldhen's desk, an old roll top in the corner of the front room, stuffed with 40 years of receipts and fishing permits and birthday cards he'd never once thrown away. Kael found a folder of tithe notices tucked behind a stack of seed catalogs, half of them still sealed. One with a T-ring on it that looked recent enough to make Rowan's stomach turn. Some of these are from last spring. She spread them across the table, before the fall, before the hip, before any of it. Rowan hadn't known she knew about the fall at all, and the fact that she did, the fact that she'd been making the 3-hour ride from Stonebridge on weekends he hadn't managed to cross 20 minutes of road from his own quarters, placed a particular heavy guilt beside him at the table. That didn't leave for the rest of the night. It was while sorting through the desk that Rowan noticed the first sign of something he wouldn't fully understand until later. A section of the baseboard near the hearth had been repointed, the mortar between the stones fresh enough to be a different color from the rest, the joints cleaned with a precision that had nothing to do with Aldhen's rough, practical hands. Rowan knelt and ran his thumb along the edge. The work was immaculate, tight even. The stones seated with the particular care of somebody who understood how weight transfers through a wall and where a foundation starts to speak before it starts to crack. And there, pressed into the mortar while it was still soft, so small you'd miss it if you weren't looking, a mark, a stone shaper's mark, the kind of signature a guild-trained mason leaves in their work the way a painter signs a canvas, not for credit, but because the building deserves to know who touched it. He didn't recognize the specific mark, but he recognized the hand. The same hand that had run along the kitchen counter 3 days ago reading the stone, the same hand that had held a skinning blade in a dead woman's kitchen in another story. No, that was someone else's life. This hand belonged to a woman who had been quietly repairing this hold for longer than Rowan had been coming home to check on the man who lived in it. He didn't say anything about it, not yet. Some truths are better carried a while before you set them down in front of the person they belong to. They were still sorting through notices when hoofbeats came up the drive. Torvin let himself down from his horse like he owned the hitching post, and by the time he reached the porch, he already had the smile on. The one Rowan remembered from childhood, the one that arrived right before Torvin asked to borrow something he had no intention of returning. He stepped inside without quite being invited, boots tracking lake road dust across the floor Kael had swept that morning. Figured I'd catch you both here eventually. He was a few years older than Rowan, had been since they were children, and had never once stopped reminding everyone of it. His eyes went to the papers on the table, then away from them, fast enough that Rowan noticed. "How's the sorting going? Hard business, all this." He shook his head with the practiced sympathy of a man who'd rehearsed it on the ride over. "Told Halwick I'd help however I could. We're managing." Torvin's tone eased, the particular lubricated smoothness of someone who's about to do you a favor you didn't ask for. "You'll want to think about your options. Old place like this, tithes the way they are. There's people who'd take it off your hands quick. No fuss. Save you both the headache." His eyes moved to Kael, and something harder entered his voice, something that had been waiting underneath the helpfulness the whole time. "No offense, Kael, but you're not exactly blood. Orc blood on a deed stone that's been human for 3 generations. Can't imagine you want to sink your savings into a hold that was never really yours to claim." Rowan was on his feet before the decision to stand had finished forming. "She's got the same claim to this hold I do. Aldhen made sure of it. Hearthstone clause, bondscribe witnessed, names carved in stone. You'll want to get used to that." Kael hadn't said a word since Torvin arrived. When she finally spoke, her voice carried the particular level calm of a blade being drawn slowly from a sheath. No urgency, no wasted motion, just the clean sound of something that had been waiting and was now ready. "I loved that man for 15 years before you ever bothered learning his birthday, Torvin. Don't stand in his kitchen and tell me what I'm not." Torvin's jaw tightened, but he didn't have an answer for that. He held his hands up instead, the portrait of innocence, and backed toward the door. "Just looking out for family. Don't wait too long to decide is all I'm saying. Places like this don't wait around for anybody." He left the way he'd come, unhurried, certain they'd come around, and Rowan stood in the doorway watching his horse disappear down the lake road, a low unease sitting in his chest that had nothing to do with the tithes. The roof started leaking over the back bedroom the following weekend, which meant the sorting gave way to actual work. The two of them up on ladders, passing tarps and nails back and forth in a rhythm that neither of them had to think about, the kind of rhythm that comes back to a body even after 8 years of not using it. She held the ladder without being asked. He found himself handing her tools before she reached for them. Somewhere between hammering and not talking about anything that mattered, it got easier to be near her, the way a bruise gets easier to touch once the worst of the swelling goes down. "You still can't whistle." She was watching him try and fail to call a tune he couldn't even name, her mouth doing something that wasn't quite a smile yet, but was closer to one than anything she'd given him all week. "You still correct people's grammar in your head. I can see you doing it. I've never once corrected your grammar out loud. You didn't have to. Your face does it for you." She laughed, actually laughed, not the careful half sound she'd been offering since the bondscribe's office, but the full, unguarded thing, arriving without permission and staying longer than either of them expected. And for 1 second, it was like no time had passed at all, before they both seemed to notice it and pulled back into safer territory, the way you pull your hand back from a flame you'd forgotten was still hot. That night, alone in his quarters, Rowan finally looked for what Aldhen's letter had pointed him toward. He found the lake ledger, exactly where the note said it would be, its leather cover soft with 40 years of handling. The spine cracked in the places where Aldhen had opened it most. Most of it was what he expected: fishing spots, weather notes, the names of birds seen on the water that morning. But scattered through the last several years were shorter entries, easy to miss if you weren't looking. "Kael stopped by today. Seemed tired. Didn't ask why. Talked to Rowan on the signal post. Sounds like he's working too much again. Same as always. Kael asked about him without meaning to. Told her he still fishes off the same dock." Aldhen had been keeping track of both of them, quietly, without announcement, for years, long after either of them had stopped keeping track of each other, writing their names into the same pages without either of them knowing the other was there. Tucked between the last page and the back cover was an envelope, yellowed at the edges, sealed, Rowan's name written across the front in handwriting he would have known anywhere, even after 8 years. Smaller than Aldhen's, more careful, the handwriting of someone who used to leave him notes tucked under the porch bench cushion, folded into shapes she'd learned from an orc paper folding tradition. She never fully explained, and he never thought to ask about. He didn't open it. He sat with it a long time, the weight of it in his hands far heavier than paper and ink had any right to be. And then he put it in his coat pocket, next to where Aldhen's letter had been the week before, and understood in a way he couldn't yet name that whatever was inside it wasn't only his to open alone. The next afternoon, while Kael was inside reviewing the roof damage, Rowan sat on the porch bench and let his hand rest where it always had, on the armrest, the place where the wood was worn smooth by years of elbows and palms. His thumb caught on something, a small indentation in the wood, not a crack, not weathering, a carving, a single letter, R, his initial. But it hadn't been cut with a blade or a chisel. The marks were too curved, too organic, pressed into the grain with the particular uneven depth that comes from bone, not metal. Tusk carved. Orc women carve with their tusks. Rowan knew this, not because anyone had told him directly, but because he'd spent enough years living alongside orc culture in Fen Hollow to understand the weight of it. Tusk carving is intimate. It's done only for people the carver considers permanent, not in the sense of forever, because orcs don't trust that word, but in the sense of indelible, worth marking, worth pressing your own body into wood for. Ah, dare, Geralt. He staffed his hand and crushed his leather. Shicey rose between his face and ran down. Brath, grotha forever, because of orcs don't trust that word, but in the sense of indelible. Worth marking was, work staffed myself and gain. The carving was old, years old. The grain had grown around it the way wood grows around anything that stays long enough. Kael had carved his initial into this bench with her tusk and never told him. And he had been sitting on it for days without noticing, the way you sit on top of a truth that's been waiting for you to look down. He ran his thumb over the letter once more and said nothing about it when she came out through the screen door a few minutes later, with 2 mugs of broth and a question about the dock pilings. Rowan almost told her about the sealed letter twice in the 2 days that followed, once standing in the drive as she was leaving, once on a signal post message when she asked if he'd found anything useful in the desk. Both times he said no. He hadn't found anything, and went quiet afterward, feeling like exactly the kind of coward Aldhen's note had warned him not to be. He brought Kael by the tavern 2 days later, mostly because old Marin had been asking after both of them, and partly because he wasn't ready to hand over the letter yet and needed somewhere else to put the nervous energy that was building in him like pressure behind a dam. Marin was in the back storeroom on a step stool, reaching for a crate of napkins on the top shelf, when Rowan heard her call his name in a voice that didn't sound like the voice he'd known his whole life. Thinner, lopsided, the consonants dragging on one side. His body went cold and clear at the same time, the particular trained clarity that 8 years of healer's carts had burned into his nervous system, the switch that flipped before the thinking even started. By the time he reached her, she was on the floor, one hand pressed to the shelving unit, the right side of her face gone slack in a way that told him everything he needed to know in the first 2 seconds. He knelt beside her, asked her to smile, watched the left side of her mouth lift and the right side stay flat. Asked her to raise both arms, watched the right one drift. Kael. His voice came out steadier than he felt, the particular level register he used on every call, the one that had nothing to do with how scared he actually was, and everything to do with the fact that someone in the room needed him to sound like the ground was still solid. Signal the healer's hall. Tell them stroke signs. Tell them the time. That's what they'll need first. He kept his hand on Marin's shoulder, kept talking to her, low even, the voice that belonged to the work and not to the man inside it. You're all right, Marin. I've got you. Stay right here with me. The healer's cart took 11 minutes. The longest 11 minutes Rowan had sat through in years, because for once, he wasn't the one arriving. He was the one waiting, and waiting had never been the part of this work he was good at. He rode with Maren to the healing hold in the next settlement, while Kael followed on her own horse. They sat afterward in the waiting hall under lantern light that made everything look slightly ill. Kael's knee resting against his, without either of them seeming to notice the kind of unconscious contact that happens when two bodies remember a proximity the minds haven't agreed to yet. A healer came out near midnight to tell them it had been a minor stroke, caught early enough that they expected full recovery, and that whoever got to her that fast had likely kept it from becoming something far worse. They sat afterward in the healing hold courtyard, both too wired to ride, the adrenaline draining out of them in that shaky, useless way it does once the crisis ends. And there's nothing left to do but feel everything you weren't allowed to feel while it was happening. Kael was staring at the cobblestones. I forgot how you get when everything else is falling apart. It's easier with strangers, Rowan admitted. And it surprised him how simply it came out, sitting there in the dark with the lanterns buzzing overhead and the smell of healing herbs drifting through the open window behind them. I can walk into the worst thing that's ever happened to somebody and know exactly what to do. And I couldn't pick up a signal post and ask you why you'd stopped answering mine. She didn't say anything to that, neither did he. They just sat there, both of them further out on a limb than either had been in 8 years, and let the silence hold what the words couldn't yet. It hadn't been 2 full days before Torvin's horse was back in the drive, this time with a man Rowan didn't recognize climbing down from the saddle. A man in a riding cloak too clean for lake country, boots too polished for gravel. The particular, well-maintained appearance of someone whose job was to look trustworthy long enough for you to sign something. Preston Coldwell, Regional Acquisitions for the Ironshore Trading Consortium. He extended a hand Rowan didn't take. Torvin used the particular gentleness people deploy right before they ask you for something you've already decided not to give. Rough week, I heard. Maren giving everybody a scare like that? Makes you think, doesn't it? Life's too short to be up on a roof patching shingles you can't afford, worrying about a tithe bill that isn't going anywhere. Coldwell had a folder of his own, glossy where theirs were tea-stained, and started talking numbers before either of them had spoken a word. A fast close, no inspections, gold enough to clear what was owed and walk away with something left over. We understand this is a lot to manage, especially with everything else you've both got going on. Kael cut in before Rowan could, flat and certain in a way that settled something deep in his chest. A vibration he hadn't known was running until it stopped. We're not selling. Torvin's smile thinned. You've got what, 2 weeks left now? Less? He said it too easily, too precisely for a man who was supposedly only casually aware of their situation. And Rowan felt Kael go still beside him at the exact same moment he did, both of them hearing it, both of them filing it in the same place behind their eyes. We'll manage it. Coldwell looked between them, recalculated something behind his expression, and left his card on the porch railing instead of in either of their hands. In case you change your minds. They left the way men like that always leave, unhurried, certain the math would win eventually. And Rowan stood on the porch beside Kael, watching 2 horses disappear down the lake road, both of them thinking the same thing neither of them said out loud yet. How did Torvin know exactly how many days were left? If you're still here, if you felt a stone shaper's mark hidden in the mortar, or a letter sealed for 8 years in a dead man's ledger, or a cousin who knows too much about a deadline he shouldn't. Part 3 is where 8 years of silence finally break open. Kael says the things she's been carrying since the night she left. Rowan learns that the story he told himself about why she disappeared was wrong from the first word, and a sealed envelope lands on a kitchen counter between them, like a grenade with the pin already pulled. Come back for part 3. Old Maren called that evening from her daughter's spare room, already fighting the healer's orders to rest, wanting to know if they needed anything. And half the settlement seemed to have heard about the tavern by then. 3 separate neighbors left covered dishes on Rowan's porch. By Thursday, none of them asked for, all of them arriving with the particular, wordless efficiency of a community that doesn't ask whether help is wanted, because the question itself would be an insult. One of them was Forge Master Bram from the ironworks on the corner of the settlement square, who had sold Aldhen lumber and hardware for 30 years on a running account he'd never once collected on time. He didn't say much, just set a foil-wrapped dish on the step and stood there a moment, holding his cap the way men do when they're about to say something they've been carrying. Your uncle vouched for me with the trade guild once, back when nobody else would. Least I can do is make sure you two eat something this week. Then he was gone before Rowan could think of anything to say back, and it struck him, standing there with a casserole dish in his hands, that what Bram had just done was a kind of answer to the cold, efficient arithmetic Preston Coldwell had tried to hand them, a reminder that some debts are not measured in marks, and some returns on investment arrive in clay dishes you didn't ask for. Kael was quiet the whole ride back to the hold that evening. Rowan mistook it for exhaustion until she stood in the kitchen with her arms crossed. Not the defensive cross of someone closing herself off, but the bracing cross of someone gathering enough structure to say something that had been building pressure since before the stroke, before the porch, before all of it. Before the stroke fell asleep. How long were you going to let him say things like that? Without telling me you knew the deadline was closer than we thought? I didn't know he knew. That's not the same as hiding it, is it, though? You go quiet exactly when it matters most. You did it 8 years ago, and you're doing it right now. She wasn't yelling. Her voice was steady, controlled. The particular measured cadence of someone who has learned that anger is more effective when it doesn't shout, when it just stands in the middle of the room and refuses to move. I rode 3 hours every few weeks to sit with a dying man because I couldn't stand the thought of him being alone. Her jaw tightened along the line of her tusks. And I never once told you, because I didn't think you'd notice either way. That's not fair. No, it isn't. None of this has been fair. She held his gaze, steady, unblinking, with the particular, devastating directness of a person who has decided that the cost of holding this back one more day has finally exceeded whatever protection the silence was providing. Least of all the part where I stood outside that screen door 8 years ago and heard you tell your uncle it would be kinder to let me go before you turned into someone who held me back. The kitchen went very quiet, the kind of quiet that has weight, that presses against the walls and the ceiling and the two people standing in it like something with mass. You heard that. It wasn't a question. It was the sound of 8 years of a story Rowan had told himself, the story of a woman who left for a better life and never looked back. The story that had made the losing easier because at least it had a shape he could understand. Cracking down the middle, all the way through, the fissure running backward in time and splitting every assumption he'd built on top of it. Every word. Kael's voice had gone quieter now, not calmer but deeper. The register where the truest things live because they're too heavy to float near the surface. I'd ridden over to tell you I'd gotten into the Stone Shapers Guild program in Stonebridge, and I was so full of it, Rowan. I was going to ask you to come with me, or wait for me, or just be happy. And I stood right there on the porch and heard you say you were going to let me go. And I left before you even knew I'd come. She pressed both hands flat on the counter, the same counter she'd run her fingers along the first day, reading it the way Stone Shapers read everything, by touch. I told myself I was doing you a favor, getting out before you had to be the one to say it to my face. Rowan's voice wasn't steady now. The particular level register he'd spent 8 years perfecting, the one that worked on strangers, on bleeding soldiers, on anyone whose crisis belonged to someone other than himself, had deserted him entirely. I wasn't talking about letting you go from me. The words came out rougher than he meant them to, the bark still on them. I was talking about letting go of my own fear. I'd just started the wound-mender apprenticeship, and I was terrified I was going to fail out of it, and terrified that if I didn't, you'd spend 2 years in Stonebridge, wondering if you should have stayed with somebody more sure of himself. I told Aldhen I thought the kind thing might be to end it clean before I turned into somebody who made you feel guilty for leaving. He stopped, breathed, heard the breath shake, and didn't try to steady it. I never got to say the rest of it, because you'd gone quiet on me by the time I sent the next message, and I was too proud to ask why. Kael pressed a hand over her mouth, and Rowan watched 8 years rearrange themselves behind her eyes in real time. Every conclusion she'd drawn, every wall she'd built, every night she'd spent in Stonebridge telling herself the silence was proof, instead of recognizing it for what it actually was. Two proud people standing on opposite sides of the same misunderstanding, each one waiting for the other to cross first. "I wrote you a letter that same week." Her voice had dropped to barely above a whisper. "Everything I was too scared to say out loud. I left it in Aldhen's lake ledger because I couldn't make myself hand it to you, and I told myself I'd come back for it once I found the courage." A breath that sounded like something tearing. And then Stonebridge happened, and the work, and the years, and I never did. Rowan took a breath of his own, the kind that holds a door open to a room you've been standing outside of for 8 years, afraid to enter because the thing waiting inside it might be worse than the hallway. "I know, I found it." He reached into his coat and set the envelope on the counter between them. The same worn envelope, her handwriting on the front, his name in it, 8 years old and still perfectly legible. "I've had it in my pocket for 4 days. She stared at it like it might combust, like the distance between the letter and the conversation they were having right now was the exact distance between who they'd been and who they were trying to become. "You didn't read it." Aldhen didn't read past the first line either. Said it wasn't his. Figured that made 2 of us. Kael picked the envelope up, but she didn't open it. Instead, she held it against her chest with both hands over it, the way you hold something that is simultaneously the most fragile and the most dangerous object you own. And she told him, in her own voice, present tense, 8 years late, everything that letter had been trying to say. That she'd been terrified he'd let her go so easily, that she'd spent the ride to Stonebridge convincing herself it didn't matter, and never quite managed to finish the convincing. That she used to write to Aldhen because writing to him was the closest she could get to writing to Rowan without admitting that's what she was doing. That she'd never once in 8 years stopped comparing every steady man she met to the one who used to sit beside her on a bench, built for one person, and somehow make room for 2. Her voice caught, not broke, caught, the way a thread catches on a nail and holds instead of snapping. "I've fallen in love with you twice. Once when I was 22 and didn't know any better, and again this week. Watching you keep an old woman alive on a tavern floor and then come home and pick up a hammer like it was the most natural thing in the world." Rowan crossed the kitchen and kissed her before he could talk himself out of it. Careful at first, the way you touch something you're not sure is still yours to touch, and then not careful at all. Both of them finally saying with their hands and mouths what 8 years of pride had refused to let them say any other way, her back against the counter, his forehead resting against hers afterward, neither of them in any hurry to be the first one to step back. "We still have a hold to save," she murmured eventually, not moving. Tonight I'm just going to stand here and not be an idiot about this for once." She laughed against his mouth, and for a while, that was answer enough for both of them. They rode out to see old Marin the next morning, still recovering but sharp as ever, propped up on her daughter's settee with a blanket she kept insisting she didn't need. She confirmed what she'd only hinted at before. She'd watched Torvin intercept Aldhen's messages almost every week that past year, and once, only once, she'd seen him pocket what looked like a settlement notice, instead of carrying it up to the porch. Didn't think much of it at the time, figured he was being helpful. Her mouth thinned. Should have known better. That boy's never done a helpful thing that didn't circle back around to him. Back at the hold that afternoon, Kael found the rest of it, tucked behind the same seed catalogs where the tithe notices had been hiding. A glossy Ironshore Trading Consortium folder, property lines sketched in the margins and handwriting Rowan recognized as Torvin's, dated nearly a year before Aldhen died. Kael's professional eye caught every detail Rowan would have missed. The estimated lot value circled twice, a number beside it that made his jaw tighten. "He was measuring this place before your uncle was even gone." They went to the settlement council office themselves that same week. The clerk behind the counter, a heavy-set man named Foster, who'd clearly had this exact conversation more times than he cared to count, looked almost relieved when Kael asked the question directly instead of assuming the answer. Payment plan? Sure, we do those all the time. 7,000 marks down. We spread the rest across 18 months, long as the paperwork's filed before the auction date. Kael looked at Rowan. Rowan looked at Kael. They signed at the counter and split the 7,000 between them before either of them allowed the weight of what had just happened to settle. It had taken less than 20 minutes to learn what Torvin had spent weeks making sure they never asked. Nobody had mentioned it because Torvin had steered every conversation toward Coldwell's cash offer and away from the council office, 3 streets from his own front door. At the counter, as Foster was filing the final page, he paused. There's the matter of surety. The plan requires a guarantee, a bond of good faith that the deed holders intend to remain with the property. Kael reached up and unclasped something from around her neck, a small pendant. Rowan hadn't noticed before, or maybe had noticed and not understood. A bone token, smooth and dark with age, carved into the shape of a lake trout. The kind of thing that looked like jewelry, but carried the weight of something far older. Aldhen gave me this, she said. Years ago, said it was his father's and his father's before that. Said if I ever needed to prove I belonged somewhere, this would do the talking. She set it on the counter. The bone clicked against the wood with a sound that was heavier than its size. Foster looked at the token. His expression changed. Not dramatically, but the way a face changes when it recognizes something that belongs to a tradition older than the building it's standing in. He bowed his head, just slightly. That'll do. He filed the token with the paperwork, and Kael's hand stayed on the counter a moment after it was gone, resting in the space where it had been. Her fingertips pressed to the wood, the way you press your hand to a door after someone you love has walked through it. Torvin came back to the hold one more time. Preston Coldwell a step behind him, both of them expecting, Rowan suspected, to find 2 exhausted people ready to sign whatever was put in front of them. Instead, they found Kael with the Ironshore folder on the porch railing and old Marin's account written out in Rowan's handwriting on the bench beside it. Rowan didn't wait for the pitch. You told us the council wouldn't work with us. You told us this deadline was airtight. You knew exactly how many days were left because you're the one who let the first notices go unanswered. Coldwell went very still. The particular, practiced stillness of a man whose profession requires him to sense the exact moment a situation stops being an opportunity and starts being a liability. He was already stepping backward before Torvin had finished processing the sentence. This is the first I'm hearing of any of this. His voice had the clean, pre-rehearsed quality of someone who'd been trained to say exactly that sentence in exactly this situation. Torvin, we'll need to discuss the terms of our arrangement. He laughed without another word, taking whatever agreement he'd promised Torvin with him, leaving behind nothing but hoofprints in the gravel and the faint, expensive smell of saddle oil that had no business being at a lakehold in the middle of tide season. Torvin's composure cracked the way it always did once nobody useful was left to perform for. The audience gone. The mask suddenly too heavy to keep holding up. You have no idea what it was like. His voice rose, and something in it shifted from anger into something rower, something that had been sitting underneath the scheming the whole time, watching him leave everything to the 2 of you, like I was never even in the picture. You got the fishing trips, every single Sunday. Me? I got invited maybe twice a year, and only when my mother made him. His voice cracked on the last word in a way that sounded for exactly one moment like something honest, a boy still keeping score of a childhood that ended 25 years ago, still counting the Sundays that belonged to someone else. I needed this, Rowan. You've got your work, she's got her guild career in Stonebridge, and I've got a trade yard 3 months from closing, and a name on a will that says I get nothing. For a second, standing there on the porch Aldhen had built with his own hands, in the hold that smelled like cedar and lake water and decades of someone else's love, Torvin looked less like a man running a scheme and more like a child still pressing his face to a window of a room he was never quite invited into. Kael stepped forward before Rowan could say anything else. Her voice carried the particular devastating calm of someone who has measured the weight of what she's about to say. and decided the person hearing it can survive it. Barely. You didn't just cost us weeks of sleep, Torvin. You gambled with the one thing your uncle spent his whole life trying to hold together. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. The steadiness was the weapon, and she wielded it the way stone shapers wield a chisel. Precise, irreversible, every word cutting along the grain instead of against it. That's not a business decision. That's cruelty with a ledger attached. You could have asked for help. You could have walked into this kitchen and said you were drowning, and we'd have listened. Instead, you let an old man's tithe notices rot in a drawer, while you measured his land for someone else's profit. Torvin didn't have an answer for that. He got on his horse and rode, and the sound of the hooves fading down the lake road was the sound of something ending that had needed to end for longer than any of them had been willing to admit. Halwick's message arrived the following afternoon. A formal note. The bond scribe's handwriting as precise as ever, deliberately intercepting and withholding a citizen's official correspondence, constituted a settlement offense under the Postal Compact. The evidence, Marin's account, the Iron Shore folder dated before Aldhen's death. The council notices that never reached the kitchen table had been turned over to the proper authorities. Torvin would be spending more time with a bond scribe of his own than he'd planned on that year. Rowan and Kael didn't chase it any further. Some things settle themselves once the truth is finally out, where everyone can see it, and the particular, quiet justice of a small settlement has a way of doing its own work without needing anyone to push. By the time the leaves turned that autumn, Rowan understood something Aldhen must have known long before either of them had figured it out for themselves, that the hardest repairs are never the ones you can patch with a tarp and a level. The hold came together slowly, the way all honest things do. Kael brought her stone shaper's eye to the foundation work, pointing and reseating stones with a precision that made the old walls look like they'd been waiting for her hand specifically. Rowan handled the carpentry, the plumbing, the practical bones of a house that needed someone willing to crawl under it before standing on top of it. They worked in the rhythm they'd rediscovered on the roof, passing tools without asking, anticipating the next step before it arrived, the particular wordless choreography of two people whose bodies had never fully forgotten how to move around each other, even when their minds had spent 8 years pretending otherwise. Nora, old Marin, who would have fought anyone who tried to call her by her given name, came by every Sunday with something in a covered dish and something sharper in her mouth, checking on their progress with the proprietary satisfaction of a woman who considered herself an architect of the outcome. "Your uncle told me once," she said, standing in the kitchen doorway watching Kael repoint the hearthstone surround, "that the stove never drew right because the hold was half empty and it knew it." She shook her head. Man talked to this house like it could hear him. Maybe it could. On a Friday evening in early November, the first real frost of the season whitening the dock and the grass and the edges of the lake, Rowan and Kael built a fire in the wood stove together for the first time. He'd rebuilt the flue that summer, cleaned the chimney, replaced the gasket around the door. But the stove had drawn poorly for as long as anyone could remember, a quirk of the house that Aldhen had complained about for decades. Something about the draft angle or the chimney height or the way the north wind hit the roof. Kael stacked the kindling. Rowan lit it. And the stove drew perfectly, clean, steady, the flame pulling upward with a smooth, decisive hunger that had never been there before, as if the house had been holding its breath for years and had only just decided, tonight, that the air was worth taking in. Neither of them said anything about it. They just sat beside it, Kael on the floor with her back against the bench, Rowan beside her close enough that their shoulders touched, and let the warmth do what warmth does when it finally reaches a room that's been cold long enough to forget what warm feels like. Later that night, much later, after the fire had burned down to embers, and the hold had settled into the particular, contented silence of a house that knows it's occupied by people who intend to stay, Rowan found the page in Aldhen's lake ledger. The last entry, written in a hand that had already started to weaken, the letters trembling at the edges the way a voice trembles when it's saying something it knows might be the last thing it says. The stove draws wrong because the hold is half full, and it knows it. 2 names on the hearthstone, 1 fire, The math isn't complicated, nephew. It never was. He showed it to Kael. She read it once, closed the ledger, and set it on the shelf where it had always lived, beside the stove that was, for the first time in anyone's memory, drawing true. Rowan found her on the porch one evening a week later, the lake ledger open on her knees, a pen in her hand instead of a drafting pencil. The frost had come and gone and come again, and the lake was starting to hold the cold the way lakes do in November, not frozen yet, but thinking about it, the surface going still in a way that made the water look like it was listening. "What are you writing?" he asked, settling onto the bench beside her. Close enough that there was no room left for anyone to pretend otherwise, his shoulder against hers, her weight shifting toward him the way weight shifts toward a thing it trusts. She turned the ledger so he could read it. Greymere Lake, first frost. Whole hold, 2 names on the hearthstone, and for the first time in 8 years, no half of anything left unsaid. Aldhen would have liked that, Rowan said. Aldhen would have said, "I told you so." She closed the ledger. He pulled her the rest of the way into the space beside him, the space that had always, somehow, been built for exactly this, and in the firelight spilling through the kitchen window behind them, he noticed something he hadn't seen before. Or maybe had seen and not understood until now. Kael's tusks caught the light, full, curved, unhidden. The lower canines that announced what she was before she ever opened her mouth. Nobody had filed them. Nobody had asked her to make them smaller to grind away the part of her face that said orc before it said anything else. She had left a man's world rather than let him diminish her. She had ridden 3 hours on weekends to sit with a dying man who never once suggested she be less than she was. She had carved a letter into a porch bench with her own tusk, the most intimate mark an orc woman can leave, and never mentioned it, because some declarations don't need to be spoken to be permanent. He looked at her tusks in the firelight and understood, for the first time, that he was seeing her, not the version he'd built in his head during 8 years of silence, not the ghost he'd been arguing with in empty rooms, but her, whole, present, unhidden, the particular quiet radiance of a woman who had spent her entire life refusing to be made smaller and had finally found a hold with a hearthstone wide enough for her whole name. She caught him looking. What? Nothing. He kissed the top of her head, the place where her hair parted, the place that smelled like stone dust and lake water, and something he didn't have a word for yet, but intended to spend a long time learning. Just you. The bench held them both. It always had. If this story stayed with you, if you felt the weight of 2 names carved into the same stone, or a stove that finally drew right the night the hold was whole, or 8 years of silence broken open in a kitchen, you're not alone. Every week this channel builds a world like this one from the ground up, and every story hits different because every story is somebody's hearthstone. Drop your country in the comments. I want to know where this fire is burning. Which moment landed hardest? A dead man's letter that said the house was never really the point, a stone shaper's mark hidden in the mortar, proof she'd been fixing the hold long before he came home, a tusk-carved initial on a bench he'd been sitting on for days without noticing, an 8-year misunderstanding that started with one overheard sentence and no second chance to explain, a bone token set down on a counter like a heartbeat, a stove that drew right for the first time the night 2 people finally sat beside it together. Tell me, I read every single one. Subscribe to the Orcish Saga, hit the bell. A super thanks keeps the hearthstone warm for the next story. 1 fire, 2 names, the next saga drops soon, and the door is already open.